Hello, everyone. You're listening to The Right Side of Gaming. If you're not aware, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and that's true for gamers as well. So, we're going to be taking some time today to talk about how games, both video games and tabletop games, can be good and bad for your mental health. We're even going to be talking a little bit about some of the studies they've done and how they're even using some of it as therapy tools. But today, the focus is on mental health. Now, to be clear, my educational background is not in psychology or therapy or anything like that. Most of what I'm going to be discussing today are things that I have found over this month in scientific journals and studies, online interviews with therapists, reputable medical sites, some nonprofit organizations that are actually working with people to use games as therapy tools, and then news articles that quoted one or more of the previous sources. So I think we're going to start with video games, and then we'll move on to tabletop games afterwards. Video games can be good for you. They offer mental stimulation. They make you use multiple parts of your brain. And depending on the complexity of the game, you may have to do all of your thinking very quickly. You use the parts of your brain that improve development and critical thinking. You develop your problem-solving skills, especially with things like role-playing games and strategic games. They can improve your attention control and spatial reasoning. I know attention is something that we normally think as, oh, you play video games, it's going to hurt your attention span, but it can actually improve it, honestly enough. Video games can even be used for therapeutic purposes these days. We're all familiar with things like Wii Sports and Wii Fit. Well, they actually have video games that they can use to train people with degenerative diseases to improve balance, for example. You see, there's this concept of gamification, applying game structures like points and competition to something that would otherwise be routine. So yeah, it could be used to improve balance, be used to do all sorts of things. I think the most common example of like gamification I can think of is they had one of those habit RPG type things. I forget the name of it at the moment. But the concept was simple. You put in, what you wanted to do for the day, your daily tasks, and you could have weekly tasks, whatever, and you would gain XP for completing those tasks. But that would be an example of gamification. There's also a level of social interaction with video games, especially ones that require you to play online. You play an online game, you have to learn who to trust, who to leave behind. These games often encourage cooperation because a lot of times you'll be playing as a team. It gives you a chance to test out talking to new people and fostering relationships with the people you play with. And it's a great way to play, spend time with, and build relationships with your friends. In fact, we'll see them discuss this more with the tabletop stuff, but this past year or so, everyone's kind of been on lockdown. So being able to spend time with other people, even if it is playing a video game, these online interactions are huge for basically any type of social interaction that we're getting these days. This next one is a little odd, but I can understand it. Some people actually find meaning in video games. They're defining meaning as belonging to or serving something that is bigger than yourself. Being part of, say, an online world. And, I guess I can see how someone might be able to do that. But the important thing is that finding meaning, even if it is in something like a video game, can be really effective at battling depression. Video games can also boost your mood, help you relax, help you manage stress. There's definitely some good, positive mental and emotional effects that can come across from gaming. This is especially true if you're one of those people that tends to have a lot of negative thoughts. You get in your head that you're no good, that you're not going to accomplish anything, that you're worthless. And no, I'm not saying you are. These are examples they gave. I'm sure you're a wonderful person. But there are people out there that think those things. In games, you're the hero. And there's this constant feedback that you are doing good, that you are progressing, you are getting stronger, you are leveling up, you are getting new weapons, you are completing tasks and quests and earning achievements. It completely counteracts the self-defeating narratives that people get in their heads. And as much as I hate to say it, you do get a feeling of accomplishment. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just after that whole EA debacle, I know it's really weird and maybe even a little taboo to talk about feelings of accomplishment tied to video games, especially if it's, what was it? Feelings of pride and accomplishment. But video games have goals, they have objectives, they have things that you can complete, things that you can accomplish. And even though it's in a video game, it still brings you that same type of satisfaction. And it improves just sort of your overall well-being, especially for games that give you trophies and badges and things like that, that recognize that, hey, you have completed this thing, you did it, way to go. It can also help you develop a level of emotional resilience. Okay, sometimes games are frustrating. We keep failing and we don't know why, and we keep trying over and over again, and you keep failing over and over again. Well, there's something to be said for having to face and learn to deal with that failure, that frustration. Oddly enough, I actually ran into this recently with a friend who I guess was playing a game. They're having some trouble with this one part. We managed to point out maybe a different approach that they could try, especially when they were about to just get super frustrated and give up and ruin their night. And it turns out they wound up beating the level. So it's one of those things where it may seem small, but sometimes that frustration and failure in games can ruin your day, and it absolutely can in life. And it's just a nice thing to practice. And while they didn't go into a whole lot of detail, one of the articles I read was talking about how video games can help with mental health recovery. And they gave examples of anxiety, depression, ADHD, PTSD. That's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. The idea is that video games offer a distraction from all of the pain and the trauma that we're going through. And it's one of those things that you're going to have to manage it, because we're going to talk about that later. But being able to sort of escape that pain and that trauma sometimes isn't necessarily a bad thing. And if it helps people, feel a little better or move on, that can be good. The problem is usually when people are playing video games too much. Gamers report more poor mental health days. They tend to be more sedentary, and as a result, they have a higher body mass index. They have higher rates of obesity. They have higher rates of type 2 diabetes and high cholesterol. And while those are physical effects, they do have an effect on your mental health. And we're going to see them talk a little bit more later about how, physical symptoms and your health and nutrition can affect you mentally. Playing too many video games can also cause you to neglect your social skills. You're not engaging with people in real life, it's just online. After a while, your skills at dealing with people in real life get rusty. Gamers tend to be less outgoing as a result, and they're more likely to use gaming and the internet as a means of social support. And while we did talk about how video games can be good for attention, you can also develop issues with concentration and attention if you're playing video games too much. Video games are also correlated with increased depression and anxiety. but that doesn't necessarily mean it causes it. Okay, so playing more video games may mean you're more anxious and depressed. It doesn't necessarily mean you're anxious and depressed because of the video games. That could be it, or it could be that people that are anxious and depressed are playing video games more to suppress negative emotions. And that suppressing negative emotions is going to wind up being important. Because, yeah, you can use it to suppress, your pain and your trauma, like we talked about. But it's another one of those things where you have to be careful because too much of it can become a problem. I mean, it's possible to play video games so much that you get to the point where even playing the game causes you anxiety. I've talked about different sources of anxiety before, but this, I think, was a really interesting take. This study was talking about how when you're playing a video game, you can feel anxious because you know you're not doing the other things that you should be doing. Okay, so let's say you know you should be doing your work or schoolwork or chores or whatever. You become anxious because you know you're not doing that. And it's not necessarily because of the thing itself. It's not, say, the fact that you need to mow the lawn or whatever that's causing you anxiety, but it's the fact that you're thinking of the consequences of not doing it. So you know you're going to get a bad grade if you don't do your homework, and you're focusing on that bad grade rather than the fact that you're not doing homework, if that makes sense. And if you avoid tasks too much, it can lead to developmental problems. So there's something to be said for making sure you don't play too much and address the other things you need to do. Low self-esteem can also be an issue, especially if you get to the point where it nears video game addiction. You see, gamers typically aren't judged for external things when they're online, like they are in the real world. In real life, you can feel judged and uncomfortable based solely on what people see on the outside. In video games, people don't see any of that. They don't know who you are unless you reveal yourself or you tell them. So a lot of people want to just stay in those virtual worlds and avoid dealing with the outside world. Just because they don't want to have to deal with all of the stuff that comes with people seeing the outside, with being judged. There's also the potential for actual physical injuries, which I know some people might laugh at, but these can be, serious or even permanent. You get a lot of injuries that come from repeated use of muscles and tendons. It causes pain and inflammation, and it can get to the point of numbness or even permanent injury. You have stuff like carpal tunnel, which is the inflammation of a nerve in your wrist. It's going to cause pain and numbness. You have gamer's thumb, which they had a couple of alternate names, which I guess tells you how far we've come in society, because I guess it used to be called PlayStation thumb, and before that it was Nintendo-nitis. But it's when the tendons in the thumb become inflamed, and it gets to the point where it swells and it limits your movement. There's also trigger finger, which is when your fingers get stuck in a bent position due to chronic inflammation. You also have things like tennis elbow and obesity that you have to worry about. There's eye strain, headaches, poor concentration. Some video games can even cause seizures, which can be very serious. There's also the potential for emotional issues. One of the studies I looked at talked about an fMRI study, a functional magnetic resonance imaging study, where they looked at the different parts of the brain in gamers. And they focused on the amygdala. That's the part of your brain that controls fear and negative emotions. And the study showed that when your amygdala is active, when you're in pain or afraid, and you start playing a video game, the amygdala calms down. It's a way to escape and suppress negative emotions. And you can see why people would want to do that. I mean, it can be great for, say, those people that are having to deal with trauma. There's also a lot of people that sort of use video games to self-medicate. I think they said women are a little bit more likely to do so, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be good, it can be bad. We can see how maybe playing video games makes you less afraid, or helps control those negative emotions. The problem is that negative emotions is part of how we learn. They gave the example of, if a child touches a hot stove, which I have done before, it was very painful, and I've not intentionally done it since. But if the child touches a hot stove, they know not to do it again. Because video games suppress those negative emotions, it makes it harder to learn from whatever's causing them. So even though people know that their gaming is hurting them, that they are experiencing negative effects in their life because of the video games, they can't necessarily quit, and they don't understand why. Now it goes on to talk about a condition that I had to look up how to pronounce. Alexithyma. It's called alexithymia. And it's the inability to determine one's inner emotional state. So the issue here is if you suppress your emotions for long periods of time, you can develop alexithymia. And it's something that happens in gamers a lot because they're using these video games to suppress their emotions. Normally, it's a protective mechanism for young people, children, who don't have someone that can explain their emotions to them, so they suppress their emotions. It's easier to ignore it and suppress it than to feel the negative emotion or the emotional pain. And over time, they lose the ability to identify what they're feeling. They still feel their emotions. Their emotions still affect their behavior. They just don't recognize their emotions. It's definitely an issue for men because in our society, men who show emotions like fear or sadness are considered weaker or less masculine than those that don't show emotion, and it limits their emotional capacity and makes them more likely to develop alexithymia. And then these negative emotions just sort of build up and cause emotional outbursts. And we see those a lot in gamers because these are people that are oftentimes men, and they're often using video games to suppress their emotions. Everything just built up, and then like, I'm sure everyone can think of a time when someone just blew up at them. I know I had it happen to me just this past week. Someone, they lost, and at the very end of the game, just blew up out of nowhere and went on this yelling rant with all sorts of horrible things to say about everybody else. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about and have probably experienced it too. And it gets worse because, they're sitting at home playing video games all day long, to suppress their emotions. Well, that's going to affect their school, their work, their physical health, their hygiene, all this other stuff because they're playing video games instead of doing the other stuff they're supposed to do, and it just causes this sort of negative feedback loop. Well, I use video games to suppress my emotions, which causes all this other stuff to happen that makes me feel negative emotions, so I have to play video games. And you just get this horrible, horrible, ticking time bomb almost. I don't want you to, think that, video games are all bad. Again, we talked about some of the positive benefits they can have. And they're especially beneficial for adults, especially adults who can regulate their time. It's a little more problematic for young people. Some studies have suggested that aggressive video games involving teamwork and killing people, like your team-based battle royales or first-person shooters or things like that, those tend to be the most addictive for young people. And children that play high-violence video games for more than 2 hours a day show a much higher number of depressive symptoms and have more depression than those who maybe play less than that or play other types of video games. Because you didn't have that high level of depression when they were looking at low violence video games or video games in general. I know the particular study I was looking at also didn't really have it pop up in girls, but only a really small percent, like 2%, reported playing high violence video games for more than 2 hours. So, maybe if they had more of them in the study that were playing violent video games, maybe show up more. At the very least, boys that were playing these, really aggressive video games a lot wound up being more depressed. And again, there's that issue of correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. Maybe playing the video games makes them more depressed, or maybe children or people that are more depressed prefer the more violent games. I feel bad, I feel sad, and they just want to shoot someone to take it out on, basically. Another study looked at how the reason you were gaming might affect your mental health. If you were gaming as a distraction, you had higher symptoms of depression and all this other stuff. You had lower self-esteem. You had a more negative affect. Then if you were playing to establish social relations with, the more social connections you had being more positive. The particular genre didn't seem to have much of an effect in that particular study, although action games, which I assume includes your really aggressive type of games again, did have a stronger impact. But again, one of the big things you can do is to set limits. Gaming too much leads to isolation. One of the studies was talking about how gaming more than 10 hours per week is considered excessive, which as a gamer, I am shocked and appalled at because I feel like I get 10 hours and then some easily. But gaming for more than 10 hours a week, getting to that excessive level may cause anxious feelings, may make you have trouble sleeping, may make you not want to be in social situations. Could be a sign that maybe you're using it to escape life, and if you're not careful, it can lead to addiction. Now, addiction is one of those tricky issues. First, because there's still some disagreement as to whether or not video game addiction is sort of its own standalone thing, like I have video game addiction and that's that, or if it's part of some other form of disorder and this is just sort of one part or representation of it. As for whether or not there is a video gaming disorder, that depends on who you ask. The World Health Organization and the American Psychiatric Association, which I'm American, that's what I looked up, disagree. So the World Health Organization says that there is a gaming disorder. They've added it to their list. If you have a pattern of behavior for at least 12 months where the gaming is out of control, where there is an increased priority to the gaming, to the point where gaming sort of takes precedence over everything else, over your other interests, your other daily activities, and you continue gaming or you game more despite the negative consequences, or if the behavior affects your relationships, education, occupation, you may have a gaming disorder. The American Psychiatric Association didn't include it in their DSM-5, but it does include a section on the problems of video games, and you might have an issue if you have 5 or more signs in 1 year to have a problem with video games. So if you're thinking about gaming all or a lot of the time, or if you feel bad when you can't play, or if you need to spend more and more time playing to feel good, or if you're not able to quit or play less, or if you're not wanting to do other things that you used to like, or if you're having problems at work or school or home because of your gaming, or if you're playing despite having those problems, or if you're lying to people about how much time you spend playing video games, or if you're using games to ease bad moods and bad feelings, then you might have an issue And they say that the percent of players who meet this criteria is really small, like between 1 and 9% of gamers. But we do see a common theme there, where if you're playing too much and you're unable to stop, or if it sort of just takes over your life and leads to negative consequences in other areas, if you can't stop, then you might have a problem. The uptick of all of this that I'm getting is that, especially for adults, it's okay and can be beneficial to play video games. It's just making sure that you're limiting the amount of time you're doing it, that you're playing video games in a healthy way for the right reasons, and that you're still making sure that you get everything else done that you need to do in real life outside of video games. And I know that is not a popular opinion for someone that talks about games. In fact, I really don't want to have to stop and play video games less myself, but it's one of those things where it's like, okay, I can see that there is a point to all this, and maybe I do need to be more careful about how much I game, or stopping to think about why I'm gaming and making sure that I prioritize some other stuff first. Moving on to something that might be a little happier. We're going to talk about tabletop RPGs. Games like Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder and all the other variations and stuff out there in the world. These absolutely have some positive benefits. These are games that require players to work together to overcome challenges. And players can sort of experiment with being somebody else. I mean, you can be just like your character if you want, and react how you would normally react in a situation. Or you can be someone totally different. You can experience, somebody else's point of view or life experiences. It can let people feel strong and powerful in a world that, maybe doesn't let them do that very often. They can practice being leaders, practice being creative and expressing themselves. They can, vent aggression in sort of a safe way, where they can learn to speak up for themselves or be more assertive. They can do all these things because it's a safe space. It's less threatening because it is pretend. So there's a social aspect to it. You can develop connections to other people, which is a great way to fight off isolation and loneliness. You can learn skills to help regulate your emotions, because people aren't always going to agree on what to do. Okay, you have to work on your impulse control and make sure you practice turn taking and things like that, so that everyone gets to feel like they're a part of the group and contributing. It can help reduce depression and the symptoms that go along with it, like decreased motivation, bad moods. It can help boost self-esteem, helps you, practice patience, things like that. There's also the idea that it can be used to help you process grief and loss, because characters can die too, and people get attached to them. Now, I remember reading a story about this one group, and the guy in question would come and he would play, and normally, the others thought nothing of it. But they noticed that for a period there, he started getting quieter and more withdrawn. And then when his character died, he just had an emotional breakdown and started crying. And they asked him what was wrong. And it turned out that I think it was his son or daughter or something along those lines had recently just died. And I know triggering or comparing the loss of a loved one to a fictional character may not, seem like a big deal, but can be a way to sort of feel and process those same emotions. So I can understand that one completely. They also note that it can be adapted to different age groups. Maybe younger kids learn things like executive function. They learn how to make decisions for themselves and how to vocalize those decisions, how to interact with other people and discuss things to make decisions. Another example was identity exploration. I don't know how people that listen to me feel about sort of the LGBTQ type topics, especially since I don't or haven't really touched on them a lot. But I know in role playing games, usually you can play a character that is, a different gender or sexuality or whatever than you, and most people don't bat an eye because that can be just a part of character creation. It can just be a narrative choice. But some people, and I've seen people talk about doing this, will use it as a way of identity exploration. They want to come out as gay, so they play a gay character. Or they want to come out as trans. So maybe they are someone that was born male and they decided that they now identify as a woman, or they think they might. So they play a female character. And I've seen people do exactly that. And a lot of people in a lot of groups won't bat an eye because it's like, oh, it's just part of the story. But it's a way for them to sort of safely try out this new identity without people really caring or judging, hopefully. That kind of brings us to one of the other concepts of using tabletop RPGs as a form of therapy. Now, the concept of play therapy has been around for decades. Sort of using that insight to normally children, how they play, into their, I guess, mental inner lives. People are doing something similar with D&D and various games, and it's not necessarily with children. They do it with kids, they do it with young people, they do it with adults too, by the looks of it. The idea is that what happens in game often will reflect their lives outside of the game, and they're playing, let's say, D&D in a therapeutic setting. So the dungeon master is usually a therapist, and they're going to ask them questions about maybe how they are similar to or different from their character, or why their character made a specific decision. They still play the game, but they turned it into sort of a clinical experience. And in addition to your sort of normal benefits of playing role-playing games, you get sort of this routine with regular social interaction. And it allows them to sort of reflect between games, plan for upcoming sessions, and really delve a little bit more into how they feel and what they're thinking than maybe a normal session would. In fact, they've been doing this a lot more since the lockdown hit, just because it's something you can do in a group session and have people sort of see each other face to face, because that face to face connection can really make a difference. You can see people's expressions. A lot of people might depend on them for sort of unspoken social cues, but it gives them something to do while still being helpful when maybe you can't get together the same way you used to be able to. There are actually several articles talking about the use of Dungeons and Dragons, I think specifically, as a therapy tool. One of them was talking about kids specifically, I think like middle school age or so. And it was talking about how they had multiplayers that were shy, but they became more integrated in the group setting. So by playing with the others, they became a little bit more outgoing and a little bit better able to express themselves and interact with the group. It also provided them a really good setting to practice their social skills, especially in a time where they can't exactly go outside or something and meet up with other kids. And yeah, it let them work on things like anxiety or depression. But because they're doing the online version, if something got to be too much for them, they could, say, turn off their video. And then on the other side of the spectrum, it actually wound up being more helpful that it was online, because sometimes they would have technical difficulties, and that's just one more thing that they can use as a learning tool, because they would get frustrated or something and have to learn how to deal with that emotionally. It's just one more thing that can sort of be added to the various layers. They also noted that it was a great way for the kids to see sort of how what they did would influence the world for themselves and the other players. Like, one player had a really clear idea of how she wanted the narrative to go, and she tried to control the story. She would try to impose her decisions on everyone else. She tried to steal from the other players, and it caused a lot of frustration and anger with the others. But then when they spoke up and told her how she was feeling, and she realized what it was happening, she could change her behavior. So it's one of those things where, maybe that might not have come out in regular therapy, but because they were having to play a game and it could have this effect on other people with their decisions, it led to sort of that particular breakthrough. They also talk about insecurity, which is something that I think applies regardless of age. It's something I see a lot in role-playing games in general. People are insecure about their ideas. They think, oh, I don't want to speak up because maybe everyone else is going to think that I have a bad idea. Or maybe they don't feel comfortable acting as their character. Maybe they feel like, oh, well, I'm new, or I'm not a good role player, or whatever. And it can be really draining, mentally and emotionally. And it can be really difficult for people to go through that. But, I guess that's one of the great benefits of online gaming these days. It's really easy to stop or get up or leave if you have to. They also talk about using role-playing games as a method of exposure therapy, where you're exposed to situations, or you have to confront feelings that maybe you can't address in real life. Maybe you can't go through that situation, or maybe you're having trouble processing those feelings. And it lets them sort of test out how things go if they behaved in a certain way. So let's use something like a fear. Maybe they're scared of spiders, and they're not to the point where they can interact with a real spider yet, but maybe they can interact with a role-playing game spider. Or maybe they had some horrific traumatic event that they went through. This lets them address that way. In fact, they've talked about how they use it with trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder as a way to sort of address whatever caused the underlying trauma. And it lets them get some type of, I guess, empowerment that they couldn't get somewhere else. It's like, okay, maybe I can't face my attacker in real life yet, or something like that, but I can in this role-playing game, and I can at least defeat them or have success against them in there. Of course, there are risks with this kind of thing. Just because you play a lot of role-playing games doesn't mean you can sort of implement it clinically or therapeutically. I mean, you can try, but if you want to address these issues like anxiety, depression, trauma, PTSD, whatever, in a clinical manner, you kind of need those, clinical therapeutic skills to do it. For example, I have none of these skills whatsoever. I've not been trying to do any type of therapy or anything. I've just been running a normal game for one of my groups, and I'm pretty sure I have accidentally made a couple of my players horribly afraid of water to the point where it's actually caused some fear for them in real life. So, it's really easy to screw things up if you're not careful. And how effective it is still anecdotal. We don't really have any solid long-term scientific studies saying, oh yes, this is effective. But so far, they are trying to use it for things like depression, anxiety, autism, things like that. Another one of the risks is the idea of derealization. Having sort of less of a grasp on what is real and what is not, especially on players who already have difficulty, differentiating between reality and fantasy. This study talked about doing two groups, both with schizophrenia. One group was handed the books and left to their own devices. And they got obsessed with playing the game, but they wound up more disconnected from reality. The second group were given structure and rules on what they could and couldn't do. And they worked to help them keep sort of the distance from escapism, try to keep them a little bit more connected in reality. And what they found was that the second group did wind up being a little less disconnected, and they needed fewer drugs to function. So it can be really beneficial if it's done correctly. There was also talk about using it for physical therapy. People with autism, brain injuries, cerebral palsy, playing the game to develop fine motor skills, through filling out character sheets or painting miniatures. He also looked at your gross motor skills, your big body movements, through the use of LARPs, which is your live action role playing. Being able to practice those, big or full body movements, especially for people with physical disabilities. Now that can be another way to try to treat things. They even used sort of an IRL LARP example where one group or study had clues in around the city, and it was like one of those scavenger type hunts where they had to, follow the clues to stop a zombie apocalypse. But it was a way to help them work through their fears. Like they were having to get up and move throughout the world. They had to do things like take the bus, even though they were afraid to take the bus. Things like that. Finally, they've also used role-playing games as a way to help people move on from being excluded from the role-playing game community. Now, some people are excluded based on gender, or maybe they have experienced derogatory comments or toxic behavior, things like that. I think they said 42% of all gamers, nice number, have experienced derogatory comments. And that number is even higher for people that play things like collectible card games. A lot of them have experienced some form of discrimination as well. And it's sort of a way to help people, both people that were discriminated against and people that did the discrimination, to sort of get over their biases and their prejudices. Now, other areas of tabletop gaming see a lot of similar benefits as role-playing games. If you're playing one of your traditional board games, that can help with cognitive impairment, depression, reducing the risk of dementia. Because these are games that, make you stop and think. They've also talked about how newer board games are really beneficial for behavioral modifications, because sometimes they'll use them to do things like promote healthy eating or to help people stop smoking, or things like that. They're also a form of stress management and can be used as art therapy. There's just so many different types of board games out there these days. They're making so many different types of new ones. They're also good for helping children learn rules to help them be able to stay seated for a long period of time, to help them increase concentration, to help them develop socially, follow rules, take turns, share. It helps with number and pattern recognition, and mathematical skills, logic and thinking, things like that. There's definitely a social aspect. You can build positive relationships, prevent isolation. Again, especially in sort of this past year. I know it's a lot harder to get up and meet and play physical board games, but we have a lot of ways to play those same board games online with other people now, or play similar games, or maybe conveniently free rip-offs or something like that. They talk about improving relationships with friends and family, and that it can be good for family cohesion. And I believe that one. I grew up playing, really old school board games with, my family. Things like Skip-Bo and Spoiler, which are a card and domino based game, respectively, Scrabble, things like that. I knew another family. In fact, I dated their oldest daughter, actually. But the parents were, absolutely geeky, and they played a lot of the role playing games and more modern type board games. And they did all that with their daughters too. And it was a fun, relationship building exercise for them too. So I absolutely believe it when I, hear them talking about how board games, make for closer families and help families improve in communication skills and things like that. Or that could be used to do things like teach teamwork or improve memory or whatever. Miniature gaming is another good one. I haven't quite decided if I like this comparison yet or not, but it was definitely an interesting one. One of the therapists that was interviewed that I was reading compared painting miniatures to a 3D adult coloring book, which I guess, they're not wrong. But building and painting things allows you to work physically. And we already talked about how, painting things can be good to help people with their fine motor skills. And it lets you be creative and artistic. Like, I cannot draw things to save my life, but I can mostly paint inside the lines. So I can at least appreciate that. It's not mentally taxing, but it's not mindless activity either. You have to focus on it, which I agree with. I mean, I can't sort of tune everything out, but there's a lot less going on in my head when I stop to sit down and paint something, because I have to really focus, especially, since I'm one of those people who maybe doesn't have the best fine motor skills. If I want paint to go where I want it to go, then I have to really give it my attention, and it just sort of blocks everything else out of my head. And that's why, it can be good at dealing with anxiety, because you're having to focus on something in the moment. That particular therapist also said it's really good at dealing with depression, and this goes back to something we talked about in video gaming, because you're able to see your achievement. Like, you're painting something, you can see the progress you're making on it. If you actually want to sit down and play with them, I mean, yeah, you've got your critical thinking and strategy aspect, from trying to kill everybody or the other team or whatever. There's a creative and storytelling aspect to it if you decide to go that route. Like, if you want to write the backstory to your army, or if you want your fight to be telling a story. And then, of course, you have the social interaction and having to, learn and practice all the social skills that go with it, and a lot of the overlap, that we've talked about, like learning to take turns, math, all that good stuff. Now, this particular therapist brought up something that I thought was interesting. He talked about the theory of the mind, the ability to understand that other people think things differently than you do. He was saying that often our thoughts become warped, or they become warped in people with clinical anxiety, me, so I can admit to that one, um, and depression, as they'll sort of isolate and imagine the negative ways people think about or interact with them. And then you go out and you play one of these games, and you get to watch people be competitive, but they're still nice to you. And it lets you see that maybe some of your assumptions and beliefs about others don't necessarily match with reality. I guess in this case, what you think about how they're going to behave or what they think about you doesn't necessarily match their behavior. And that's where it's like, oh, these people think differently than I do. And I've come across that. And honestly, I think that happens in a lot of the sort of competitive environments in tabletop. Like, I can see the exact same thing happening in, say, a collectible or trading card game, for example. He also talked about, and I think, he specifically linked this back to painting, but I think it applies to quite a few areas in tabletop gaming. But dealing with criticism, we tend to see our own work really poorly and everyone else's work really well. And I think one of the quotes he used that I liked was like, when we look at our work, it's like we see our own blooper reels, basically. And that we can sort of compare ourselves to others. And I absolutely agree with that. I think it extends beyond just painting, but I know that's one of those areas where I struggled. Like, I would paint up miniatures for my D&D group and give them out to my players, and they would be so excited that it's like, oh, it looks so good. I'm sitting there thinking, no, it doesn't. Like, I barely did any like shading or highlighting. This is like the most basic paint job ever, but they were so impressed, and I'm over here confused. But again, it's one of those things. It's like I'm comparing myself to maybe the store-bought miniatures, or the stuff that you see online that people paint that I honestly at this point do not have the skill for. And they're just like, oh my gosh, someone made something for me. So it's a completely different metrics, I guess. Finally, if we just want to talk about hobbies in general, whether it's tabletop gaming or video gaming or whatever, having a hobby, having something you like to do, maybe even if it's something that's not even gaming related, maybe you're one of those people that, I don't know, likes to knit or something. Just having a hobby in general makes you less likely to suffer from stress, from bad moods, from depression. Hobbies make you feel happier and more relaxed. So if nothing else, you have a hobby and it's going to make you feel good, regardless of whatever of these you pick or if it's something else. I also want to take some time to reiterate something that I talked a little bit about in my anxiety video, but I think works really well here too. There's some things that gamers don't do really well. And one of those is take care of themselves. We've seen how bad mental health can lead to not exercising or poor nutrition, things like that. Well, exercise, nutrition, sleep, all that good stuff is also good for your mental health, even as a gamer. Exercise is going to boost your self-esteem. It's going to help with depression, reduce anxiety. It's going to improve sleep. Making sure you get nutrition and a proper diet is going to, again, help reduce depression, promote sort of a feeling of well-being, improve your mood. Sleeping is also going to help with, again, your mood, your irritability, patience, anxiety, depression, fatigue, concentration, memory, judgment, all this good stuff. And we see how, again, some of that, it affects your mood, which can in turn affect your gaming, and your bad gaming habits will, turn around and affect it. Like, oh, I'm playing too many video games. It affects my sleep. It affects, how much I'm eating, how I'm eating. I'm not getting exercise, and it just all sort of, cycles in and feeds into itself. So to sum up, the big takeaway seems to be hobbies in general, and that includes gaming, even video games, can be good for you. You just have to make sure that you're doing everything else that you need to be doing, that you are taking care of yourself, that you're gaming in moderation, especially when it comes to video games. Because a lot of this stuff can feed back in on itself, especially, again, with video games. You do too much, or you do something you're not supposed to, and it causes you to feel bad mentally, emotionally, even physically. And it just sort of gets into this negative feedback loop that winds up getting hard to get out of. So I encourage people maybe to take some time, for the rest of the month to stop and think about, what am I doing? Am I practicing good habits? Am I making sure that everything else I need to do, both in general and for myself or for my own health, are getting done? Am I making sure I get all my work and obligations filled? Am I getting enough sleep, exercise? Am I doing as best I can to eat right? Things like that. And to think, why am I gaming? What am I hoping to get out of it? Am I getting benefits from this? Or am I at the point where I just feel sad or frustrated or anxious? And if so, what can I do maybe to help myself improve in those areas? Thank you guys so much for listening. I know this was probably a very long and boring one for a lot of people, but it's one of those things that's important to address every now and then when you can. So again, thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you have an awesome day, and I will catch you next time.